Hey, good morning. I'm Denan, and this is episode 17 of Camellia City. And yes, I know the title is a little shocking, but we are going to talk about old time Greenville, Alabama, the beautiful, magical Camellia City. Excuse me. I'm so sorry. And some of the vice that went around in town and still does today. And I was reminded of these stories from this wonderful book by Clifton Meador. The other night, I was sitting at a restaurant, and my table was pretty close to the bar of that restaurant. And I'm not going to name that restaurant. You can guess it yourself. And a woman, a professional lady, was at and you know what I mean, was at the bar, and I heard her through about a span of about 20 or 30 minutes, work her way into the conversation of a group of men to solicit them. And it took me a minute, and then I was like, oh, she's a hooker. Okay, I get it now. And just the way she was drinking at the bar, and, she was a little bit aggressive with saying hello and trying to party with them a little bit, and was making some sexual comments. And at some point I realized, as they must have realized really early on, before I did, oh, this is someone who has sex for money. Don't be shocked. Now, if you're sitting there shocked, honey, let me tell you about Greenville, Alabama. So, you guys, I've used this book before, and I'm going to jump around a couple of chapters, but this is about Greenville, Alabama in the 1940s. And Clifton Meador has said several times during that time when he was a child, Greenville was known as a two-whore town. But right now I want to talk about the taxi driver Sloop. So there was one taxi in town owned by Sloop, and he parked his taxi on the street in front of the pool hall and the Waller Hotel, which is across from the railroad station, which is now the Chamber of Commerce on Commerce Street. His car was a 1933 four-door Ford with taxi written with long strips of white adhesive tape on the front doors. In white paint below that was the number 297-W. Sloop had worked out a deal with the Waller Hotel to answer his phone calls. If somebody rang, the hotel clerk would yell out the front door for Sloop to come to the phone. And he was usually asleep behind the wheel, by the way. There was almost no taxi business from the incoming trains and buses. Traveling salesmen arriving by train could easily walk to the hotel. It was right at the train station. Friends and family coming in were usually picked up by other friends and family. But in spite of the lack of prospects for a taxi driver, Sloop always met the two incoming buses from Mobile just in case. He also met the number 1 train from Montgomery to the north and the 1 p.m. number 4 coming from Mobile to the south. To understand exactly how Sloop made a living with his taxi, you have to understand the ramifications of Butler County being a dry county. That means, no alcohol being sold there. None. Now, look, Greenville or Butler County remained dry, I think, until I was 12. And I remember listening to the vote come in on WGYV that evening. On the radio. We put on the radio to hear if we were going wet this time. and when we went wet, when Butler County went wet, it was, my poor grandmother. She just thought, that's it. Pack it up. It's over. The heathens have won. Oh, so this is back in, and I've read, by the way, in the Historical Society, there was a newspaper article or an ad put in the Greenville Advocate by the Methodist preachers. I think this was back in the 50s now, that said, any Methodist who votes for this county to go wet you're no longer a Methodist. Just think about that, buddy. I don't think that would work today. Every few years, somebody raised the issue of getting legal drinking on for a public vote, on a referendum for a public vote. But every time that happened, two forces rose up to oppose it. Number one, the bootleggers, of course, and number two, the churches. The saying was that the bootleggers went down one side of the street while the church ministers went down the other. This unlikely coalition managed to keep Butler County and Greenville dry. At that time, there were only 11 counties in the whole state of Alabama, which is crazy. I didn't know that. That could sell beer or whiskey. The state actually owned and operated all the liquor stores in those counties. Lowndes County was a wet county closest to Greenville. Fort Deposit, 12 miles to the north, was its county seat. Sloop made the 24-round trip several times a day, hauling whiskey to Greenville citizens and mostly to the Waller Hotel and the traveling salesman. Most of Sloop's income came from that. So, obviously, what a great, need. You're in a dry county and you got a guy who'll go get you liquor. Who'll make the drive to go get you liquor, right? Growing up, alcohol simply wasn't around. I don't recall ever going to a teenage party where anyone served or allowed alcohol of any sort. He's saying his daddy was a near teetotaler under orders from his mom. This is what I love. As I said earlier, my dad made 5 gallons of scuppernong wine each year in the legal limit. So at some point, I guess you could make your own wine if it wasn't too much. And I'd have to look at the laws for that, but I think that's really interesting. But Daddy's teetotaling didn't keep him from studying the drinking habits of others in town. Somehow he knew every drinker in Greenville, just like I think everybody in the beautiful Camellia City knows that still. He came up with several interesting observations. One was that you could figure out where big drinkers lived by observing how often Sloop's taxi was parked outside their house. Another was that you could tell the amount of drinking in a house by the amount of outdoor furniture in the yard. None of the houses in those days were air-conditioned, of course, so getting outside was a main method for cooling off. It's a fact that drinking alcohol makes people feel warmer, which would require they spend even more time outside, hence his daddy's deduction. From biking around town, I think his observation was accurate. In addition to running whiskey, the other primary source of Sloop's taxi business came from driving the traveling salesman to and from one of the 2 whorehouses in town. So this is where we get Greenville in the 1940s was a 2-whore town. Louise and her daughter Pearl, as you know, lived north of town, and Ma Gooden lived south. Louise had the majority of business. Bill Waller, whose father owned the Waller Hotel, was an acquaintance of mine from school and a close observer of Sloop's comings and goings. Bill watched and made mental notes of which salesman chose which whore. He estimated Louise was 10-1 over Ma. Ma was more of a redneck whore than Louise, who better suited the tastes of the suited traveling salesman who stayed at the hotel. Okay, first of all, the fact that there was a madam or I don't know what you want to call it, a lady of the evening named Ma. I'm sorry. Maybe Ma was a looker, but her name is Ma Gooden. How? Okay. Sloop, and here's about, we're going to talk about Sloop a little bit because it's pretty interesting. Sloop was a strange-looking man, tall and extremely thin with sparse black hair. His nose caved in at the bridge, resembling a small saddle. His teeth were notched and separated, and he couldn't hear very well. We sensed there was something wrong with Sloop, but we didn't know what until John happened to talk to his distant cousin, who was one of the town's doctors. He told John that Sloop had been born with syphilis, a congenital syphilis. Not only was Sloop born with syphilis, but he had developed a double rupture in his groin. Several men in town were said to have double ruptures. The term struck pure terror in all of us teenage boys. We could never get an accurate description of what exactly a double rupture was, but it sounded like some sort of explosion in the genitals. Sorry. None of the men ever worked again after double ruptures. People said it resulted from lifting something heavy the wrong way. From that time on, we were terrified of lifting anything. The combination of Sloop's odd appearance, congenital syphilis, and double rupture made him someone we avoided. He generated a kind of terror and wonder in all of us. There was, right or wrong, an aura of low-grade evil about him that made him untouchable. Getting syphilis from sex was bad enough, but here was someone born with the disease. We wondered if he might somehow pass on either problem if you touched him, and we kept our distance. So, poor Sloop, right? Okay, so I want to talk more about the horse situation, but first, I think I need to, because I've read this book before, and I know this is all tongue-in-cheek and we've been laughing, but seriously, this is going to get into I think we're tiptoeing into the realm of underage prostitution here. And I know things were different back in the past, and I don't know how old this young lady was. Maybe she was an older teenager. I don't know. But just warning you, there are going to be some stories of a younger prostitute. And, that's a serious problem. I don't want to get into it, but that is a serious problem this town has had in the past with pedophilia and underage prostitution, slavery, as far as I'm concerned. And I've heard that a book will be coming out about that in the future. And when it does, maybe I'll get an interview with the author. Okay, so Pearl is the daughter of the uptown whore, Louise, okay? So Pearl had given the boys an anatomy lesson back at school one day. And I'll probably get into that story one day. I guess she just pulled up her dress or something. Whew. Okay, so he's talking about his friend Charles. And Charles's father was a salesman. So when we were about to turn 15, which was the legal age to get a driver's license in 1946, we took every opportunity we could to practice driving. And the best was when Charles's father would let us drive him on his salesman routes. Charles's father's nickname was Lum. How he got that name, I never knew. Most everybody in Greenville and the surrounding Butler County knew Mr. Lum. He was a man who lived by his wits. Mr. Lum sold or traded just about anything to make his living. The back seat of his old two-door 1939 Chevy Coupe was piled with clothes samples, catalogs for shoes, hats, gloves, overcoats, suits, and any other clothing item, plus colorful catalogs for an array of seeds, flowers, and shrubs. On top of all that, he carried bulk cloth for making clothes. You name it, and Mr. Lum either had it in the back seat or he could measure you for it on the spot. Fill out an order form and have your order in the mail on the same day. All those samples, materials, and catalogs formed a huge mass in that back seat, which either Charles or I would have to sit on while the other one drove. In addition to selling nearly anything you could order by mail, Mr. Lum would trade for anything. Charles never wore the same wristband for more than a month before Mr. Lum would trade it for something, anything. One time I watched Mr. Lum trade Charles's wristwatch along with an old rowboat he had on a trailer behind the car. He threw in a new Sunday suit, measuring the man for it while standing in a ditch on the edge of a cotton field. In return, Mr. Lum got 11 gallons of honey, an old horse, and 3 bushels of sweet potatoes. He had traded houses, cars, boats, horses, pigs, cows, all sorts of vegetables, tools, tractors, wagons, and on down an endless list of unrelated things, animate and inanimate. Their yard was filled with stuff he had taken in trade and hoped to trade again. One piece of business I have not mentioned was one of Mr. Lum's mainstays. That was burial insurance. He and Mr. Hudson were the 2 burial insurance agents in town. You'll meet Mr. I'll tell you about Mr. Hudson and Miss May later because that was funny. Brown Service Burial Insurance sold for 10 cents a week. The tough thing about the burial insurance business was that the agent, Mr. Lum, in this case, had to collect a dime each week and every week and give a stamp in exchange for the dime. The owner of the policy then put the stamp in a book, and when it was full, he or she would get a certificate of paid-up burial insurance. I never was sure how long it took to pay off a policy, but my father calculated that if you paid out the whole thing, it would cost much more than a fine burial would cost in cash, of course. The policy was a good deal financially only if you died prematurely. All that aside, burial insurance at a dime a week was popular among whites and blacks, and Mr. Lum was big in that business. I'm sure he saw it as a wonderful lead-in for all the other things he sold, of course. Charles and I loved it because Mr. Lum let us rotate driving his car on rounds while he kept books in the front seat. He would jump in and out as we moved house to house down the back streets of Greenville. Then we would drive to the country where the houses spaced out longer between stretches of road, which we were preferred for driving practice. On these rides, Mr. Lum carried a constant conversation on almost any topic, most of which centered on the price and value of nearly everything. One day, with no advance notice, we pulled up to the house where Louise and Pearl lived. Charles and I looked at each other and smirked. There we were, actually parked on the side of the road in front of the house of Greenville's best-known whore and her daughter. We were wide-eyed and trying our best not to burst out laughing. Mr. Lum said nothing, but got out of the car and jumped across the clay ditch that ran along the side of the road. He had to take one of those long, awkward jump steps to clear it, and at the same time got over the high Johnson grass that filled the ditch. With a good jump over the grass, he landed at the edge of Louise's clean, swept front yard. So obviously these aren't grassy yards, these are dirt yards. The frame house had never been painted. It was built on a raised foundation, so looking underneath it, we could see all the way through to the backyard. Chickens and a couple of hound dogs lived up under there. The high front porch had a swing at one end and 2 front doors. On his way to the front steps, Mr. Lum stepped in some chicken dung. He stopped to clean the sole of his shoe with a stick. He stood on the ground and leaned against the high front porch, scraping and scraping for the longest time, making a lot more out of it than seemed necessary. The old hound wobbled up and sniffed out the situation carefully, then ambled on back under the house, unimpressed. Charles and I couldn't figure out what was going on, but it later occurred to me that stepping in the chicken mess gave Mr. Lum the perfect excuse not to go up on Louise's porch. No matter who lived there, you didn't track poop up on a porch. By keeping a respectable distance from this house of ill repute, Mr. Lum was saying to Charles and me, "Look, this is very professional. I'm here on burial insurance business and nothing more. I am standing in the front yard, not even on the steps, and certainly not on the porch itself, and most certainly not near Louise's front door, and obviously not in her living room or anything near those things that go on here." If Mr. Lum had been talking, I'm sure that's what he was trying to tell us by not going up on the porch. He finally knocked on the floorboards of the front porch. In a few minutes, Louise appeared at the door in a thin negligee opened down the front. She smiled broadly at Mr. Lum and said, in a no-fooling kind of voice, "Lum, honey, what on earth are you doing standing down there on the ground? Honey, come up on the porch." Mr. Lum's face turned crimson. Pointing toward the car, he said in a halting voice, "Got my son, his friend with me, stepped in this chicken mess here to collect the policy." Louise leaned down to see us in the car, and when she did, the negligee fell away from her body and both of her breasts appeared. Full-on nudity. I was riveted. Then she waved at us all friendly, and I tried to grin like nothing was wrong. I'm sure I looked like the Cheshire Cat with that forced smile on my face. I could hardly breathe. I felt my heart beat in my neck and my face flushed. Louise disappeared in the house. In a minute she returned and leaned down to even lower to give Mr. Lum a dime. Again, we got an eyeful. It was the first time I ever saw female breasts, the same for Charles. Daughter Pearl had given us our first look at the lower parts of the female anatomy, and now Mama had introduced us to the upper. So there we go. Meanwhile, it was business as usual for Mr. Lum. "Ain't you going to pay for Pearl's policy?" he asked Louise. "Hell no, she's got to pay her own burial policy from now on," she answered. "Pearl's big enough to shake her own ass now." Okay, so that's the part that bothers me a little bit. Pearl came to the front door and peered out onto the porch. "Hey, Mr. Lum," she said. "Mama told me I was going to pay my own burial insurance from now on. Just a minute, I'll get a dime." She reappeared and handed Mr. Lum a dime, then looked towards the car. "Hey, boys," she called in our direction. "Come see me when you can. I'll show you some fun." Now, that seems a little, okay, whatever. I'm going to leave that alone. "Hey, Pearl," was all we could manage. Charles and I looked at each other. I don't know what color my face was, but Charles's was deep red. Despite Pearl's open invitation for sex, we declined. The idea of paid sex, combined with the fears of VD, made sure of that. Not to mention the Baptist promise of going to hell for an eternity for lying down with a whore. God only knew what punishment having paid sex with a teenage daughter of a whore would be. We weren't going there. We never saw Pearl again. She dropped out of school the year we delivered Mr. Lum to the house to collect burial insurance. And I always wondered what happened to her. And I kind of have too, because there's a couple of stories of Pearl and, growing up as poor as they did in a small town, and becoming a prostitute early on. I don't imagine things were really great for Pearl later on in life, and I don't know what happened to her, or Louise, or Ma out in the country. So, I don't know if I find any other stories about these ladies. I do hope things ended well for them, but I don't know. And I wonder about the lady at the bar the other night too. Some things never change, right? All right, well, thank you for listening to this episode, and I'll have some other interesting stories about the magical Camellia City at another time. Thanks. I love you guys. Mwah! Bye.